Alright, we're down to the final topic. What about comments? All comments are not created equal. Comments are both a necessity and a crutch. Some comments can and should be avoided. Other comments are indeed useful. So in this module, we'll look at specific examples of each so that you're clear when comments are warranted and when they should be avoided. So when I ask interviewees what clean code is to them, they almost always mention comments. And comments indeed have their place. But here's the thing. Over-reliance on comments is a code smell. And if this is all you can say about the topic of clean code, that's not a great sign. Comments should only be chosen as a solution after consideration of the alternatives. Like any other data structure, there should be a clear reason to justify their existence. There's no shortage of opinion on the topic of comments. It sure gets these girls fired up. Now, Sally has some good points. Comments are sometimes not kept up to date, and they can be used to explain confusing code that could simply be refactored in a cleaner manner. But Julie has an important point too. Many developers think their code is clean enough that it doesn't need comments, but as we've seen throughout the course, clearly conveying intent is not easy. So you're probably looking for a definitive answer to the bottom line question. Are comments great or a code smell? As we'll see, comments are both. Comments are both a necessity and a crutch. Let's review a couple rules that will help guide our conversation. First, prefer expressive code over comments. Comments are useful, but when code could do the same job with equal clarity, we should choose to make our intent clear in code instead of comments. Why? Well, code is more likely to be kept updated by maintenance programmers and is, of course, the definitive reference for what the code is doing. Second, we should use comments when the code alone can't be sufficient for providing the necessary documentation. Here's a list of comments that we should try to avoid. Let's go ahead and walk through these one by one. At the top of our list are redundant comments. Redundant comments repeat exactly what the code says, right next door. So there's really no value added here, and we'll look at some examples. Here I am setting I to 1. I am instantiating a new user. Or I am marking my default constructor. Finally, I'm calculating total charges. Here I've repeated the exact name of my method up in my comment. Now, the problem with redundant comments is they break the dry principle. You are repeating yourself. You've now created two different points that you have to maintain, and you've really added no value. This is also lowering the signal-to-noise ratio. This is extra text that the reader is typically going to read, but they're not getting any value from it, as there's no new content here. You'll often see these when people require comments on every single method. And especially down here, this calculate total charges, for instance. It's not really necessary to add a comment on every single method if your methods are named well, and in this case it is. So there's no additional fidelity that comes from this particular comment. So you might as well just remove it and free up a few lines on your screen. So in summary, here's two rules to avoid redundant comments. First, assume that your reader can read code in the language that you have written. Second, don't repeat yourself. The code itself conveys all the information that you need for these simple examples. No comments are necessary. Throughout the course, we've discussed the merits of conveying your intent in code where possible. In this example, the developer is using a comment to clarify what the magic number 2 stands for. This is easily refactored out via a well-named constant, or in this case, an enumeration. Now the code clearly conveys intent, no comment necessary. There's a number of ways to avoid needing to create an intent comment, including creating an improved function name, declaring an intermediate variable, creating a constant or an enumeration as we saw above, or finally, refactoring a conditional into a well-named function. Apology comments. These are the comments that make maintenance programmers want to cry. You finally navigated to the point where the bug was reported, and just to find a comment like this. Comments like this are a sign that the original developer just didn't bother finishing the job. It's malpractice because it leaves a mess for someone else to have to clean up later. Here's another example. This developer was so exhausted after merely getting it to work that they left a mess that no one else has hopes of easily understanding. Keep in mind, no one likes apologizing, so why not just avoid it? Instead, fix the issue before you commit or merge your code. Or, if for some reason that's not possible, add a to-do marker comment if you must. We'll talk about to-do comments shortly. Warning comments are closely related to the apology comments we just discussed, but they're arguably even worse. Why? Well, they're also warning that lousy code is ahead, but with warning comments, the developer isn't even bothering to apologize. Warning comments are often characterized by a warning that a section of code can only be touched by a certain developer. Sometimes warnings are indeed necessary, but in many cases, they're simply a sign of an area that needs to be refactored. Say you're house sitting. You walk in the living room and you see this. Imagine your inner dialogue. It's a nice house, but that's ugly and odd. I need to turn on the light, but what's with the tape? And what would happen if I remove this tape and turn it on? Perhaps you decide to call the owner. Oh, I put a ceiling fan in, but it wobbles and crashes to the floor when I turn it on. I'll fix it at some point. Yeah, sure you will. Until then, this bizarre taped switch remains. We don't accept half-baked features on our homes, so why should we do so in the code that we support? So what does this odd behavior look like in code? Well, it looks like this. Imagine you're reading through code trying to fix a bug or add a feature. What do you do when you come to sections of commented out code? It totally disrupts your flow. These sections of commented out code are zombie code. Why zombie code? Well, zombies aren't really dead. As horror movies have taught us, though zombies appear to be dead, they're still alive enough to haunt us. In the same way, zombie code straddles this line between alive and dead, just waiting for a chance to ruin our day. Commented out code is alive because it's in the current codebase. Programmers stumble across it in a keyword search and interact with it during maintenance and refactoring. But the code is also dead because it's not executed in production. Thus, it's a zombie that should be buried pronto. Today's code never really dies. As long as you have source control, there's always a historical reference that will get you back to previous versions. I propose that there are two root causes for the ongoing problem of zombie code. The first is risk aversion. Some developers view deleting code as inherently risky. They lack the strength of conviction and sense of purpose that's required to delete unnecessary code, so they hoard it in comments where it can live to haunt another day. Sure, it's easier to not even think about whether code should remain in the codebase, but code must be deleted regularly because great developers know that code is a liability. Less is more. And yes, keep in mind, commented out code is still code, but it's code that's not solving any problems. It's just getting in the way. Second, there's a problem with a hoarding mentality. Developers may argue that they comment out code just in case it might be useful to someone later. This is hoarding, and it does us all a disservice. Code that is no longer useful for production remains in source control history. Remember, with source control, deleted code doesn't die, it's merely buried alive. Commenting out code just creates noise for the reader and saddles our application with technical debt. Commented out code is just as useless to the application as this old trash is to this kitchen. The old wrappers and labels tell a story of what we used to do in the kitchen, but at the expense of us getting anything new done efficiently. As we've discussed throughout the course, when writing code, we must strive to keep our signal-to-noise ratio as high as possible. This aids in comprehension, speeds reading, and helps protect us from creating buggy code due to misunderstanding. Zombie code is directly opposed to comprehension. It slows reading and maintenance because less actual production code is on the screen at any given time. It's visual noise because it's unclear if one should read it at all. For some reason, we often accept this compromise as developers, but we'd never accept such sloppiness in the real world. Imagine if the New York Times looked like this. We would not stand for this. Notice how reading the text doesn't flow? The increased noise hurts comprehension, and it's difficult to ignore the commented section even though it's likely irrelevant, or worse, misleading and incorrect. Now, one could argue that source code isn't the finished product, so a comparison to a finished publication is apples and oranges. Okay, but we must remember that every line of code written will be read an average of 10 times. So yes, our readership is smaller than the Times, but it's an important readership with a loyal following. It's us. Zombie code makes the story unclear. Should a programmer spend time reading the commented out code or not? Commented out code also creates ambiguity about whether the code should have been commented out at all. Imagine you're a maintenance programmer who stumbles across a swath of zombie code around an area where a bug has been reported. The programmer's job is now much harder. The commented code must be read and comprehended to determine its potential impact. Was the code accidentally commented out for testing and never reverted? Perhaps the person who commented it out can help. So who was that? An investigation ensues. This additional ambiguity takes time to resolve and adds mental weight to what could otherwise be a simple debugging process. This ambiguity also hinders refactoring. Remember that we should regularly be leaving the code a little better than we found it. But when a class or a method contains a chunk of zombie code, things get tricky. If I refactor this section, do I need to consider this commented out code? Will it be turned back on again soon? How will it interact with my new implementation? These are questions maintenance programmers shouldn't have to ask. Furthermore, integrated refactoring tools won't make corresponding changes to commented out code. Thus, as methods, variables, and classes are renamed and signatures are changed, the commented out code falls behind. When commented out code is resurrected, it's highly likely the app won't even compile. So in summary, zombie code's a problem because it reduces the readability of our code. It creates ambiguity because we need to wonder whether the commented out code should have ever been commented out in the first place. Perhaps it's the very reason that the bug is occurring. This also hinders refactoring because we have to consider whether the commented out code needs to be refactored when we're changing other code around it. It also adds noise to searches. When we're doing keyword searches, zombie code shows up and it really should no longer be in scope. Finally, code isn't lost anyway. Remember, with source control, we can always get back in time to see previous versions of the code. So here's a mental checklist. If you're about to comment out code, ask yourself, when, if ever, would this code be uncommented? If there's not a definitive impending date, then it's likely it never will be uncommented. Can I delete this and simply get it from source control later if necessary? Is this incomplete work that should be rolled back and worked via a branch instead? This avoids adding noise and confusion for others. Is this a feature that should be enabled or disabled via configuration? If you're commenting out code to temporarily disable a feature, perhaps a configuration setting would be more appropriate. Finally, did I refactor out the need for this code altogether? If it's no longer necessary, just delete it. If you've ever maintained a codebase burdened with extremely long functions, then you've likely seen this trick. When functions get too long, developers often resort to using comments to break up sections, as you can see here. If your function has gotten so long that it's getting hard to navigate, consider refactoring to a few separate functions to enhance readability and remove the need for the divider comment altogether. Much like the divider comments we just discussed, brace tracker comments are used to help developers navigate really long stretches of code. So here's the idea behind brace tracker comments. When the body of a conditional grows long enough that we can't fit it all on the screen, then when you see a closing curly brace, it can be really unclear what it's closing. So these brace tracker comments sit here at the end of the conditional and tell us what it's closing. Now, this sounds like a friendly idea, but there's a better alternative. Just like divider comments, it's easily avoidable by refactoring to a function. This separate function will enhance readability, and it also reduces the cyclomatic complexity of the function. Hey, check out my flashy bloated header. Back when I was working regularly in the Unix shell, we required a similar boilerplate template at the top of every file. The idea was to enforce consistency and make sure we had all the info we needed if a bug popped up. But there's a number of issues with this particular example. First, avoid line endings on comments like this. Keeping those asterisks at the right place is really a hassle. Enough so that some developers may decide not to update the header at all to avoid it. Second, don't repeat yourself. The file name is completely obvious by viewing the file itself, and the author and the created date should be accessible via source control instead. Finally, rather than creating your own ad hoc style for comments, follow your language's style conventions. Okay, you do use source control, right? Well, if you don't, I highly recommend it. And if so, then you can avoid using comments like this for logging defect fixes in your code. Change metadata belongs in source control, not code. Adding comments like this to code can quickly make reading a really noisy chore. Imagine how annoying it would be to read a book filled with all the author's notes about where they fixed logical fallacies and typos. It would make following their story much more difficult. Defect log comments cause these same issues. Alright, enough with the negativity. Now let's walk through some examples of clean comments. Don't you wish you had more time to make your codebase better? Well, in the real world, we often have to settle for making a note of something that we'd like to do at a later time. To-do comments are handy because they allow the developer to easily get back to a specific section of code that needs more attention later. Now, I hesitate to call to-do comments clean since they can certainly be abused, but they're useful enough that Visual Studio even provides a dedicated task list window where you can see any comments that begin with to-do, hack, or undone. Here's a few tips for assuring to-do style comments remain useful. First, if your IDE of choice doesn't offer this support, make sure you standardize as a team so that everyone understands the intent of these comments. Second, watch out for to-dos that are actually an apology or a warning in disguise. If there's time to do it right now, finish it, because the fact is, these are very often just ignored. I've seen many codebases littered with to-dos from well-meaning programmers who have never gotten around to working through their task list. But when used judiciously, to-do comments can be a handy way to keep track of open items that need attention in the short term. Summary comments offer much the same benefit to readers as an introduction at the beginning of a book. They prepare the reader for what to expect. Good summary comments describe the code at a high level that's not necessarily apparent by simply reviewing the class or the function's name. They're often particularly useful for providing a high-level overview of classes, since a class name alone isn't typically sufficient to fully convey the scope and interactions of the methods inside. However, be sure you're not using summary comments to augment poorly named classes or functions. Small, well-named functions are often so self-documenting that a summary comment would simply be redundant. So, seek to convey your intent in code, but be sure to add summary comments to give your readers the high-level context that they need. Sometimes we have important data to track that just isn't possible to convey in code. In these cases, comments can help us provide documentation directly within the code where it's most likely to be useful. Documentation comments such as these are often helpful when interacting with third parties. In this module, we saw that comments are both a necessity and a crutch. Our goal is to write self-documenting code. Our code should convey intent without the need for comments when possible. We looked at 9 types of comments to avoid, including redundant comments that merely repeat the code, intent, apology, and warning comments, which are all a sign that the code could be refactored, zombie code, which should be deleted, divider and brace tracker comments, which are a sign that the method should be split up, bloated header comments, which are a pain to maintain, and defect log comments, which belong in source control. We also looked at 3 generally clean comments, including to-do comments to mark work that needs to be completed soon, summary comments that provide a high-level overview, and documentation comments that provide critical inline information that can't be conveyed via code. In the next module, let's put everything we've learned to work. We'll refactor an ugly chunk of C# code into something clean.